Happy New Year, everyone! 2023 is off to a strong start because the 4th episode of The Chosen Season 3 premiered on New Year's Day, and now it's time for us to break it down to see exactly what happened and where we land at the halfway point of the season. Before we do so, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you know when other videos like this are coming your way. That being said, let's get to the episode. The episode begins with an opening montage giving some snippets and highlights of the apostles as they go about their mission, overlaid with a beautiful black and white filter. In Joppa, Thomas and John grant sight to a blind woman and find themselves shocked by their newfound power. They preach excitedly along the roads to all the passerby who will hear. In Nave, Andrew preaches to the gathering crowds as Philip entertains children. The crowds eventually turn against them and they're kicked out. In Perea, Nathanael preaches intensely while Thad heals and embraces all who come his way and heals an extremely sick, bedridden woman. In Caesarea Philippi, Simon and Judas come across a pagan sacrifice and demonstration and begin drawing crowds as they share the news of Jesus and taking crowds from the other guy. Later, Simon calms a demoniac woman until Judas casts the demon out. In Sharon, Big James preaches until Little James steps forward and heals a lame boy, rejoicing through tears as the boy rejoices and he remains unhealed. Still, they excitedly preach to crowds all that they've heard. In Jericho, Matthew and Z are escorted into a locked room where Z wrestles a demoniac to the ground before Matthew casts the demon out. Later, Matthew preaches while Z helps a lame boy to his now working feet and continues to heal all that come their way. At all the locations, the apostles teach the crowds the very same things they first learned from Jesus, as demonstrated through the reciting of the Lord's Prayer. We cut to the opening credits. After the credits, we cut to the Capernaum synagogue, where a rabbi is teaching from Leviticus 15. Zebedee notices that his sons are quiet, paying more attention in synagogue than they used to. There's a commotion outside, and Yusuf rushes to discover its source. A tunnel leading to one of the local cisterns is ruptured, overflowing the sewage line and leading to contaminated water. When Yusuf asks what can be done, Julius and his comrade explain that unless the Jews themselves do something about it, it won't get done until it becomes a priority for Rome. Yusuf asks what materials are needed and takes matters into his own hands. Yusuf approaches Jairus, who is quick to hide the scrolls he is studying as soon as Yusuf enters. Yusuf explains the issue with the cistern, an issue Jairus had been unaware of, and says that he will take care of all the financial needs coming from a wealthy family of manufacturers who own a stone quarry in Jerusalem. Jairus explains that Shmuel and Shammai have been asking for a detailed report of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He admits that he read Yusuf's letter to Nicodemus, but Yusuf gets defensive, explaining that he was emotional and that his conclusions couldn't possibly be true. Jairus isn't so sure. He spent the last month comparing Jesus' sermon with the scriptures and says that he is beginning to see the light. Torah points to Jesus, while dogma and tradition are what blind people from the truth of his claims. In fact, he says that Jesus could be more than a rabbi, but his conclusions are so amazing and seemingly far-fetched that he can't even bring himself to finish them. He's aware of the consequences of his beliefs, but says that he's convinced that they are true, and Yusuf reluctantly admits that he and Nicodemus believe as well. They both agree that Yusuf should dilute his account of the sermon, lest they arouse the excess attention or concerns of the Sanhedrin. Due to the closed cistern, a growing congregation of women begins to form at the well just outside of town. Meanwhile, Simon returns home, sneaking up on Eden and embracing her. He doesn't notice all the changes she's made around the house, and though she apparently has something that she wants to tell him, he's hungry and exhausted from the trip and is quick to accept her suggestion that he go take a nap. He tells her that the other guys are going to drop by the house tomorrow to debrief on their journeys and asks if she could make some more bread. She is evidently agitated, and he goes to take a nap. As Eden exits to retrieve water, she comes across a woman from Caesarea Philippi who offers to take her to a secret spring just outside of town in order to avoid the multi-hour-long line to the well. Jairus returns home, where his wife and his 12-year-old daughter Neely are preparing food. Neely's stomach begins to hurt and she collapses onto the ground. Jairus rushes in and lifts her into his arms, carrying her to a bed before rushing out of the room. Eden and the woman, Veronica, make their way out to the spring, where Eden catches herself being unnecessarily snappy and abrasive. She apologizes, and as the conversation ensues, she learns that the woman is unmarried, which surprises her given the length of the journey from Caesarea Philippi to Capernaum. She catches sight of the woman's dirty clothing, which is covered in blood. Tamar and Mary Magdalene wander through Matthew's house, where Tamar is quick to criticize all of Matthew's belongings. When she suggests auctioning everything off, Mary brings up Tamar's own unwillingness to depart with any of her own belongings, such as her jewelry. Tamar argues that her jewelry is her family history and that she carries the lives of her ancestors with her on her body through her jewelry, which Mary politely yet firmly points out sounds a lot like pagan animism, which doesn't really jive with following Jesus. Tamar argues that Mary doesn't know what all she's been through, but when Mary responds the same, Tamar says she's heard rumors, a biting remark targeted at Mary's questionable past. Mary says that they need to ask Judas about matters of money since he's the one in charge of the treasury, and just then Zebedee comes to the door. He asks them to try his first batch of olive oil, and while Mary is gentle in her correction, Tamar spits it out and offers a long, drawn-out criticism detailing her vast travels and familiarity with good oil. Tamar suggests that they should use Joanna's fabric to invest in a new business venture in order to attain better olives for Zebedee to use, but Mary points out that the fabric was donated specifically for the ministry and that all financial matters need to be brought before Judas first. The apostles gather to discuss their mission. Simon can tell something is bothering Eden, but she won't tell him what it is. The discussion amongst the group starts off with everyone excitedly relaying amazing things Jesus did through them, but Big James dampens the mood whenever he says that he thinks the entire thing was a big mistake that's just going to cause them more headaches and hardship than it was worth. John suggests that James is really just jealous about John's growing relationship with Thomas and Jesus, but James argues that he doesn't care about that anymore. He says that Jesus gave them power but no understanding, but Nathanael and Judas counter that maybe they didn't need understanding. Little James says he felt Jesus giving him the words to preach, but Big James says he just felt like a fraud by preaching things that he himself didn't practice. Andrew says he felt the same way, but it didn't really bother him, while John says that he just felt powerful. Philip points out that could be dangerous because they're turning inwards rather than focusing on Jesus, and finally Eden, annoyed by all their bickering, says to just ask Jesus about it whenever they see him again, and Matthew says that sounds like a really good idea. Simon gets on to all of them and tells them to be mindful of what Eden is sacrificing and giving up for them, but when Big James apologizes, Eden says it's no big deal. Andrew can tell something's going on between Simon and Eden, but neither of them are willing to talk to him about it. Out at the docks, Zebedee is selling his fishing boat, explaining that his goals have shifted. He isn't working for himself anymore, but for a higher cause. He's going into the olive oil industry to raise money for the ministry. Eden comes across Veronica again at the spring. Over the course of their conversation, she learns that Veronica came to Capernaum to hear from the popular preacher. Eden says that she has heard him and was deeply impacted by him, but that a lot has happened since then. Veronica explains that she has had a discharge of blood for 12 years, leaving her weak, unmarried, and unwanted by even her own family due to her perpetual ritual uncleanness. She warns Eden not to touch her unless she wants to go a week without touching her husband, but Eden explains that wasn't a problem to begin with. Veronica says that the doctors she has seen have only made matters worse, but she hasn't lost hope yet. There might be something that she hasn't done yet that could, in fact, heal her. Yusuf comes across Jairus, who explains the developing situation with his daughter and implores Yusuf to do everything he can to have the cistern fixed as fast as possible. He asks Yusuf if he is being punished by God for believing in Jesus, and Yusuf apologizes, taking full responsibility for sharing that letter with Jairus to begin with and asking Jairus to take it all back. But Jairus says that taking it all back wouldn't change what he believes. Down in Jerusalem, Shmuel and Yanni attend the gathering of the Sanhedrin, where Shammai proposes a new edict wherein anyone teaching things that don't come from a respected rabbi or which invoke the messianic title Son of Man will be deemed false prophets and be brought before the courts and answer to the high priest. The vast majority voted in its favor and the edict is passed, but Shmuel finds his hopes crushed in realizing that the whole thing was just a political game for garnering support for Shammai, while few people seem to be taking the threat of Jesus seriously. The other guy, who was giving me strong Gamaliel vibes, I've got to say, says that if Jesus is as big of a deal as Shmuel suggests, they'll hear about him eventually. That night, Simon and Eden lie in bed, both awake, but neither talking to the other. Veronica returns clothes to a local pilgrim, but when he sees the blood dripping on her foot, he renounces her as unclean and rebukes her for being so inconsiderate, and she rushes away with tears in her eyes. Returning to Simon and Eden, they're up now, and things aren't looking so good. Simon says that he'd apologize if only she'd tell him what he did wrong, but she says that it has more to do with what he hasn't done, but she still won't tell him what it is that he hasn't done. He wants to fix things, but she says she shouldn't have to tell him, and just then Jesus knocks at the door, inviting himself in along with a whole slew of other disciples. The crowds begin to gather around, flustering all the disciples and ultimately leading Simon to lash out at Jesus for treating his house like a meeting place and a forum. Jesus responds that a house can have many functions, leaving Simon to storm out of the house. Andrew goes to stop him, but Jesus tells him that Simon has to handle things alone. Simon wanders to the synagogue, where he comes across Gaius. He hints at his frustration with Jesus and tells Gaius that they really need the cistern fixed, but Gaius says that Quintus doesn't want to pay for it. Simon says that they're at an impasse, which seems to be the theme of the night, explaining that they've reached an obstacle where they can't undo what they've done in the past. Gaius offers Simon a drink, but when Simon says he can't drink from such a vessel, Gaius starts complaining about the Jews and all their rules. Simon explains that Jesus is going to undo some of that. Gaius asks if Jesus is back in town, but when Simon refuses to answer, Gaius says that he knows Matthew's back in town and bets Simon 20 denarii that he ends up liking Matthew, but Simon rejects that, pointing out that he doesn't gamble anymore. Gaius advises Simon to lay low and stay out of trouble, and suggests that if he wants to stay out of his house also, he can help rebuild the cistern, even offering to oversee the labor himself. Gaius notices that Simon has been tying fisherman knots the entire time, and the two bond over their shared skill. As Gaius leaves, he tells Simon that if he wants to mend things with his wife, he should get used to saying 5 words. You are right, I'm sorry. Jairus' wife asks him if he's checked on Neely, and when he says that he hasn't, she offers to do it. We don't know what she sees, but it must be bad because the episode ends with her yelling his name at the top of her lungs. I thought this episode was good. Not my favorite of the series, but it set in motion a lot of stuff that will have some great payoff later on in the season. I will say that more than any other episode so far, I had the toughest time following the plot of this episode, not in regard to the storylines themselves, but rather in regard to when everything was supposed to be taking place. Towards the end of the episode, we see Simon and Eden lying next to each other in bed at nighttime, immediately followed by Veronica returning the clothes to that pilgrim guy around what seemed to be either dawn or dusk, and that scene was immediately followed by Simon and Eden arguing in the kitchen on what appears to be the next night, but I'm not sure if it's supposed to be the same night they were in bed and they got out of bed, and I'm just really not totally sure what's going on there. Stuff like that doesn't affect my appreciation of the developing plot lines or anything like that, but whenever any TV show or movie does that, I think it can have the unintended effect of drawing the viewer out of the show, where they're just trying to figure out how all the moving pieces fit together in terms of time, and it really distracts them from just focusing on the story itself. I've never felt this way about an episode of The Chosen before, but for some reason, as I was watching it, it felt like they had to reshuffle some storylines and that maybe they filmed it one way and then had to change the order of events in the editing process. I know that's way overthinking it, but I can't help but notice stuff like that whenever I'm watching a show. And the unintended effect is that it takes you out of the story and leaves you processing all this stuff rather than actually focusing on the story at hand. That being said, I don't want you to take that as a criticism because overall, I really liked all the things that they're setting up in this episode. The conflict between Simon and Eden is probably one of the realest marital conflicts I've ever seen put to screen, yet it's something so subtle and common that I imagine everybody has been in their same situation before. I'm inclined to take Simon's side on the issue, but I totally get where Eden's coming from as well. I also enjoyed the conflict between Tamar and Mary. Tamar has a whole lot to learn, and you can see that Mary is striving to be gracious and patient while also knowing that she needs to address some of the major elephants in the room, but I really like some of the stuff that they're addressing with Tamar here in regards to the pagan animism and kind of wrestling through how your past beliefs and your past culture might unintentionally affect the things that you believe nowadays, and how sometimes holding a Christian worldview might not be totally consistent with that past stuff, and I really like what they're developing with that. I also have to say that Jairus really impressed me this episode. I wasn't sure what to think of him whenever we met him earlier this season, and I think that was intentional, but I love how they've developed his thought process, and I'm excited to see the events that we're going to see unfold in next week's episode. Other than that, we have a huge development here with the edict that they ratified in Jerusalem, and I think that the effects of that edict are going to be felt all the way to Jesus' arrest, trials, and crucifixion in season 6, so that's a really, really exciting development, a lot of good stuff in this super packed episode, another good one from The Chosen. Other than that, that's all I've got for us today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and before you click off this video, be sure to go down to the comments and let me know your thoughts, whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me, what your favorite scene was, what you would rank it with all the other episodes, how you would rate it from a scale of 1 to 10, all that stuff. Let me know in the comments down below. Also, be sure to click the like button so YouTube knows videos like this are worth watching, and while you're at it, hit that notification bell so you know when more videos like this are coming your way. I've got a whole lot of The Chosen and biblical content coming your way, so be sure to tune in for that stuff. Until then, I'm David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. Catch y'all later, and Happy New Year.